For our call to worship this morning, we're going to do a responsive reading using the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So I'll begin, and please read the italicized. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. There are some things in our social system to which all of us ought to be maladjusted. Hatred and bitterness can never cure the disease of fear. Only love can do that. We must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. Before it is too late, we must narrow the gaping chasm between our proclamations of peace and our lowly deeds which precipitate and perpetuate war. One day we must come to see that peace is not merely a distant goal that we seek, but a means by which we arrive at that goal. We must pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means. We shall hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. Amen. She writes, "When I was a child, I would stand and gaze at the starry firmament and contemplate infinity. As I stood there, the boundary that is time dissolved. I expanded my spirit to fill the boundary that is space. My being stilled, and all fear, anxiety, and anguish disappeared. Forgotten were the chores, the homework, the ordinary around me. Transcending boundaries was fun in those days, but as I approached adulthood, it became more difficult. More and more, the world was with me as I did chores and homework. More and more, my own fears were with me as I encountered others. More and more, I became aware of the boundaries of race, class, age, gender. I felt myself cringe as the bantering youth in the street came nearer. I felt myself become tearful as I encountered a senior citizen living with pain or the limited choices on a fixed income. I felt myself become angry as I was subjected to indignities of being rejected by others because I am Black, because I am woman, because of the blind or openly gay person I was with. I felt myself become unwilling to acknowledge my oneness with the addicted person who is my friend, or the homeless people sleeping on benches in the park. Today, transcending boundaries is hard work. For one thing, I've created more of them since I was young, and I've built them higher and stronger than they once were. For another thing, I'm much more self-righteous and much less humble than I was then. Sometimes, when I'm at my best, I remember that the other I distinguished myself from could be me in another time, another place, another circumstance. Then I remember the words of a colleague who observed that it is my racism, my sexism, my homophobia that I am called upon to address. And so I take a few deep breaths and begin to release the fears that are the boundaries between me and my fellow humans. Would you please join me in a few moments of silent reflection? I used to laugh at my friends in seminary when it was their turn to preach in class or the chapel. Most, if not all of them, were Christian, and they would always begin their sermon with a prayer. And it went something like this: "May my words be guided by your grace and be heard by those with open hearts." And I used to tease them that they were sort of hedging their bets, that if someone listening didn't like what they heard, that the preacher could always say, "Not my fault." Well, after my sermon a couple weeks ago, or was it last week? No, 2 weeks ago, I don't have the same theological belief as my seminary mates, and so I can't have the same out. But I will say this today, that this topic is hard. This topic is hard. It's a topic that is so important for us to talk about, but uncomfortable to do so. Yet many of us here today have the luxury of choosing whether or not to talk about it. So many others do not have the luxury of choosing whether or not to engage. They are engaged simply because of one aspect of their identities, because of the color of their skin or their identity as Black. We are here today marking an anniversary. It has been 50 years since the events occurring in Selma, Alabama. Many of us know the story, and some of us, I would hazard a guess, might even remember it unfolding in real time. Anybody? Yeah? Yeah. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference began a campaign in January of 1965 to fight for voting rights acts in Selma, a place where less than 2% of the eligible African Americans were registered to vote. February 1965 saw multiple marches and protests answered by violence, arrests of hundreds of people, and the death of a marcher, Jimmy Lee Jackson. Sunday, Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965, a protest march from Selma to Montgomery begins but is violently turned back at the Edmund Pettus Bridge by state troopers and a sheriff's posse. King calls on religious leaders to join him in Selma. Among those who answered the call are 40 Unitarian Universalist ministers. March 9th, 450 religious leaders joined 2,000 of marchers for a second march over the bridge. This night, 3 Unitarian Universalist ministers are attacked outside a whites-only restaurant, and the Reverend James Reeb is fatally injured. 2 days later, March 11th, James Reeb dies. Thousands of people across the country protest, and King says, "This was not so much the attempt to murder a man as an attempt to murder the hopes and dreams of a people." March 15th, hundreds of Unitarian Universalists, among many, many others, join in Selma, and President Johnson introduces the Voting Rights Bill. March 21st, with the National Guard protecting them, 3,200 marchers leave Selma for Montgomery. 4 days later, 25,000 demonstrators join the marchers when they reach Montgomery for a final rally at the state capitol. That night, Unitarian Universalist laywoman and mother of 5, Viola Liuzzo, was shot and killed by Ku Klux Klansmen as she was driving to Montgomery to pick up a carload of marchers. In the months that followed, the 6 men that were charged with the murders of Reverend Reeb and Viola Liuzzo are acquitted of murder. The 3 men charged with Liuzzo's murder were later found guilty of conspiracy to violate her civil rights. In August 1965, the Voting Rights Act is signed into law. And some of you may have seen President Obama yesterday, his passionate speech in Selma. He mentioned 3 who died in Selma. 2 of them were Unitarian Universalists. We remember Selma because in that place at that time, the best of many people shined through as hope confronted hatred, as violence and suffering was met with resolve, sacrifice, and determination. We remember Selma because in that moment, the voice and will of the people was heard and yielded real systemic change in the form of the Voting Rights Act. But Selma was and is only one step on a long, long journey, beginning well before 1965 and continuing on to this day and beyond. Indeed, as Michelle Alexander writes in her book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness, if Martin Luther King Jr. is right, and here King is actually quoting Unitarian minister Theodore Parker from a speech that he gave in 1857. If Martin Luther King Jr. is right and the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice, a new movement will arrive. If civil rights organizations fail to keep up with the times, they will be pushed to the side as another generation of advocates comes to the fore. Hopefully, the new generation will be led by those who know best the brutality of the new caste system, a group with greater vision, courage, and determination than the old guard can muster, trapped as they may be in an outdated paradigm. This new generation of activists should not disrespect their elders or disparage their contributions or achievements. To the contrary, they should bow their heads in respect, for their forerunners have expended untold hours and made great sacrifices in the elusive quest for justice. But once respects have been paid, they should march right past them, emboldened, as King once said, by the fierce urgency of now. Since our beginning, Unitarians and Universalists have been champions of freedom. As those bucking the established order ourselves, freedom is key to our self-identity. Freedom, by its very nature, places an imperative on the free person that this freedom be expanded to all. UU Minister Mark Morrison Reed says that Selma was a test of sorts for Unitarian Universalists, or UUs. It was a point at which we were asked if freedom simply meant freedom of belief and conscience, or did it also include the civic, political, and economic freedoms that our generally educated, middle-class, liberal religious constituency took for granted. And UUs of the day answered loud and clear, responding in the hundreds and living out our Unitarian Universalist values. So here we are today, marking this anniversary, yes, but we're also here to shine a spotlight on the ongoing systemic racism in our country and to bear witness to the struggle for human rights, civil rights, and voting rights that is happening now, today, on our watch. The Voting Rights Bill was born from the blood and suffering of Selma, and it's being rolled back. We have lawmakers in Selma this weekend for a photo op, remembering Selma 50 years ago, while they're opposing legislation that would It's called the Voting Rights Amendment Act, that would restore a key piece of the landmark law nullified by our Supreme Court in 2013. Democratic Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, who introducing the Voting Rights Amendment Act last year and has yet to find a Republican co-sponsor, said, "The best way we can honor the brave marchers of 50 years ago and the countless others who sacrificed their lives for civil rights is not with medals and words, but also with meaningful legislation that protects the constitutional rights and advances the principles that these people marched for." The march continues. There is a racial caste system in our country that has been mostly hidden until recently. Cornel West, who is the Ware lecturer at our upcoming General Assembly, writes that it is America's shame, the massive use of state power to incarcerate hundreds of thousands of precious, poor, black, male, and increasingly female young people in the name of a bogus war on drugs. This so-called war on drugs began in the 70s under Nixon, but it was the presidency of Ronald Reagan that marked the start of a long period of skyrocketing rates of incarceration, largely thanks to this unprecedented war on drugs. The number of people behind bars for non-violent drug offenses increased from 50,000 in 1980 to over 400,000 17 years later. And when I say people, these people are mostly men of color, mostly black men. Our criminal justice system is bordering on just criminal, as it creates and perpetuates a racial hierarchy in our United States. There is little room for the American dream that anyone can make it out of our ghettos and slums when the cards are so mightily stacked against young, poor black boys and men. This is not a war on drugs. It is a war on our poor, black, and disenfranchised communities. On July 13th, 2013, Alicia Garza waited anxiously for the jury decision in the murder trial of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. The verdict of innocent for the killer, George Zimmerman, led to social media comments such as, "We knew he was never going to be convicted of killing a black child," or, "What did you expect?" Garza disagreed, and she wrote that murder should always come as a shock, and ended with this: "Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter." And a friend of Garza's picked up on her post and began hashtagging Black Lives Matter onto the walls of close friends. And the two friends then decided to encourage supporters to share stories of why Black Lives Matter. Then last August, Ferguson, Missouri, 18-year-old Michael Brown was shot and killed by Darren Wilson, a police officer. In the weeks that followed, hashtag Black Lives Matter became synonymous with the protests taking place across the country. Although it is true that all lives matter, this phrase, Black Lives Matter, was specifically intended to convince the Black community and others to name Blackness as part of a broader conversation about racialized violence. The Department of Justice report that came out this week is a horrific list of unconstitutional practices, police brutality, and disregard for basic civil rights. Granted, it deals with Missouri, but to a greater and lesser extent, these similar charges may be leveled at police departments across our country. The Black Lives Matter movement has brought to national attention the fact that people of color are disproportionately targeted by police stops, arrests, and police violence. And it goes on to highlight that once people are in the system, they tend to receive subpar legal representation and longer sentences, and are less likely to receive parole. The deaths of Eric Garner and Michael Brown and the list of others are not isolated incidents, but part of a larger story of state violence against people of color. Black youth are well aware that the system does not value their lives. We need a united social movement to rip out racism at its roots and dismantle the system that makes these young people unable to see that their beautiful Black lives do matter. In the late 1960s, maybe some of you remember the Black is Beautiful movement and the creation of Kwanzaa to celebrate Black culture. We saw affirmative action programs to improve the roots of the problem of poverty and lack of education, to truly try to level the playing field and integrate the power elite. But then came the war on drugs propaganda, which was and is a war on these poor Black communities. Then came Rodney King and police brutality and Hurricane Katrina, where a disproportionate number of people who died due to lack of rapid government response were poor and Black. Then came the list of Black men and boys killed by police and police wannabes. Is it any wonder then that the Black Lives Matter movement is fighting to confront violence against people of color all over the country? It calls our attention to these police killings, which are almost never prosecuted. It calls our attention to vigilante killings, and it calls our attention to the laws and policies that allow these deaths to continue almost without consequence to the perpetrators. Just as Martin Luther King put out a call 50 years ago, a similar call is being issued today. Black Lives Matter. They call, join us to change the world. Join us as we work against the moral catastrophe that is the racist caste system in our country today, played out in this war on drugs and the ongoing poverty of so many people of color. This call is to all of us. All of us that live in this country carry with us our own story of racial and ethnic identity. And whether we like it or not, for those who are white, the story carries with it an education in racism. Even if we're the most sincere, liberal, and well-meaning people, just as our brothers and sisters who are Black cannot escape systemic racism, our brothers and sisters who are white cannot escape the fact that whites are caught up in the systemic racism also, as they reap the advantages of white privilege. Although in school we're taught that America was founded on the ideals of democracy and freedom and tolerance, and I believe in those ideals, and I think you believe in them also, this country that we love so much was also founded on the genocide of Native Americans and on the enslavement of Africans. Racism is woven into the law of our land, as white people were and are privileged over people of color. And as we note this 50th anniversary of Selma, it's also the 26th anniversary of the short paper by Peggy McIntosh that changed many people's understanding of whiteness in our culture. Her paper, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Backpack, describes white privilege as this invisible package of unearned assets which are meant to remain invisible. The challenge for us then is to name these assets, recognize them for what they are, and know that oppression takes the form of both the oppressions that we can see and those that are so embedded in the system that the dominant group usually can't even see them. The challenge is to learn how to be white in a way that is positive, anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and in solidarity with communities and people of color who are leading the way. For as long as our beloved country has existed, the scourge of racism has existed with it. Legal oppression in multiple forms has been the law of our land. But the good news and the hope is this: for as long as there has been oppression, there have been brave, brave people standing up and speaking the truth to power, demanding that we live up to our ideals of freedom and democracy. The dream and the struggle has been passed down from generation to generation. And they say, this is what we have been able to accomplish. We have put our bodies on the line for justice. Now you go and do likewise. And slowly, slowly, the pendulum swings, sometimes backtracking, but generally moving toward a more equal, more just society as the law and culture of our land. I end today with a piece that was written by Kenny Wiley. He's a Unitarian Universalist religious educator in Colorado. I met Kenny a couple years ago when the congregation that I was serving was chosen as a partner mentor to the congregation that he was serving. The program was called Leap of Faith, if any of you have heard of that. Kenny and I had the opportunity to have many long conversations about serving Unitarian Universalist congregations, about being people of color in this faith, about hopes and dreams. In fact, Kenny was the first person to congratulate me on the UU webpage that announced it's a UU webpage that announces ministerial changes. And so he was the first one to congratulate me as I was called to serve Live Oak. So, this is written by Kenny Wiley. With a friend, I walked from Brown Chapel to Edmund Pettus Bridge on a muggy June evening. On the way, we stopped at the marker honoring Reverend James Reeb, the white Unitarian minister from Boston who was killed after answering doctor's call for clergy to come to Selma. Kneeling in front of Reverend Reeb's marker drove me to tears, to an understanding of history's importance. Finally, after ignoring the race problem for years, we showed up in Selma. But 50 years later, if we use show up in Selma, but not Ferguson and other places, and not for all those black and brown victims of police violence in the sadly inevitable future, we will not have learned from our past. The harrowing truth is that I could be the next Mike Brown. My household had 2 parents. I have a college degree and a job. My pants don't sag. But when I'm out protesting or canvassing, none of that matters. I cannot opt out of blackness, and I do not want to. In the wrong situation, though, my respectable nature may not save me from a racist police officer or citizen, nor from the ensuing character assassination. I would go from the decent, reasonably friendly guy that some of you know, to a mentally deranged Harvard dropout who was no angel and deserved what he got. There are so many things to fight and to fight for in the world, and we Unitarian Universalists do a mostly good job on climate justice and immigration. Our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or LGBTQ work has saved and changed lives. Black lives, too, are worth fighting for. When the next Ferguson happens, and sadly it will, we can and must do more. We have to show up, be willing to follow others, and mostly be willing to change ourselves. Amen, and blessed be. 50 years ago, marchers in Selma linked arms as they crossed the bridge. I invite you to try to link arms today. You might have to squish in a little bit, but get a little bit comfortable here. Don't worry, perfection is not part of this. And so symbolically, we link our arms today as we rededicate ourselves to crossing the bridge for freedom and justice again. Our faith, this congregation, is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our differences and beneath all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together in spite of time and death and the space between the stars. Let us pause in silent witness to that unity. And as you go forth into your week ahead, may the blessings of love be upon you. May love's peace abide with you, and may love's presence illuminate your heart now and forevermore. So be it. Amen, and blessed be. And now we extinguish the light of our communal chalice, and the congregation says,
We